Hello guys, and welcome to part 2 of the post-apocalyptic zombie diorama. In the last video I constructed the main buildings, including adding the brickwork. I added the windows and the doors and some basic rust effects, and I left the diorama looking like this. This video was going to be the final part of the series, but as the build progressed I realised I needed to add more and more things. So this video will primarily be about the oil weathering of the buildings, plus the accessories I built to go in the alleyway below. So my first job was to finish the rust effects on various items. I added some metallic grey paint to some of the rusted items. And then I needed to add rust effects to the fence at the end of the alleyway as well. I did this using the standard 3 Vallejo colours which I use for rust. And this also gave me a good opportunity to recover from the mess which I had made with the super glue on the fence. So you can see there are quite a few bits where the glue has spilt and left it looking a bit strange. I've just painted those as if they were bits of rust. And you can see also I did some sponge chipping with a darker grey colour on the fence posts as well. And I used a similar technique with the metallic grey and the rust colours on the ventilation covers on the roof. I used oil paints for the majority of the weathering, and you can see some of the colours I've used here. Mainly the artist oil paints, burnt umber, light mud, a black, a raw sienna. And the first way I used the oil paints was to thin them down to make a wash. And I used these, especially the dark colours, over patches of the brickwork. I didn't use them over the entire brickwork because I didn't want a uniform colour. To be honest, I don't think some of these washes were particularly visible, but I do think the black one that I used here was more effective. And they did work well to add some depth to the cracks in the concrete. I also used the darker brown oil paints to add some translucency to the rust effects. Another thing I did with the oil paints is what armour modelers would call a dot filter. So I applied dots of various coloured paints onto the brick surface. And then using a brush which is either dry or only very slightly damp with thinners, drag those down the wall, up and down, keeping the strokes vertical, and that will simulate dust and dirt and grime and so on, rain streaks, etc. I made sure that I went across the graffiti decals which I put on earlier to try to make them blend in with the wall a bit more. And as many of these things, it looks quite messy at first, but of course you can blend them, and even if you don't like the colour you can take them away with enamel thinner. I really enjoyed this stage, and personally I think that wall has come out very well. I use the same technique on the brickwork. I use them on the concrete to the top of the wall. And personally, I'm really happy with that effect. I think it really adds a massive tonal variation to that wall there. There's barely a brick which is the same colour. It really adds to that old, neglected building look, in my opinion. And I think that decal there of the graffiti finally looks a little bit like it's blended in. Even though you can't see the brick shapes through it, which is a bit disappointing, it doesn't look like it's just been stuck on top. The third way I used oil paints was to simulate dust and dirt and mould, primarily at the bottom of the buildings. To do that, I put the oil paint on directly and blended it in with a dry brush. And of course you can go over and add more layers or slightly different colours as much as you want to try to get the desired effect. And here I'm using some green oil paint to do exactly the same thing, not across the entire wall but just in a few areas to simulate damp or mould. And especially on the smaller building I did this a lot. Under those tiles which are slowly peeling up, I've put a few bits of green there and mould on that one. At this point I decided to break up the monotony of the wall a little bit by adding a broken drain pipe. I got this from one of those old mini art ruined building kits. Painted it black, put a few bits of rust and dirt on it. And then I used the green oil paint around the broken parts of the pipe to simulate moss growing where the water might have been dripping down. There we go, I'm really happy with that effect, and I think the addition of the green at the top and the bottom seems to have aged that building by a good 10 years, which is a really nice effect. It's exactly what I was looking for. So I wanted the alleyway to be fairly full of junk and general detritus, partly to give the abandoned feel, but also to make it smaller and narrower and to kind of increase that feeling of entrapment. So one of the first things I built was one of these garbage dumpster things. Unfortunately I lost the video footage of me building it, but basically this is made out of styrene, painted black on the inside, blue on the outside. The wheels were from an armour kit of some description, I forget what, and the rail there is also from a tank, I forget where that came from as well. And the handles for the lids, they came from a T-34. Now of course I wanted this dumpster to be pretty heavily worn and damaged, but before anything else I wanted to put the decals on. I wanted most of the chipping and the rusting effects to have taken place after the graffiti. So again I went back to my faithful old Green Stuff World graffiti decals and found a couple which would fit. And I wanted some generic sort of ID number or something similar, so I picked up some decals here from an old Sherman kit, I think this was, and I used the number from that as a sort of general serial number kind of thing. I cut this graffiti decal in two because the lid is going to be separate. And then I started the chipping process using a lighter colour of the base colour. I painted these chips on with a fine brush, trying to make scratches as well. If you look at reference images, these things can be pretty beaten up. And as I said, I tried to make sure that these chips went through the decals, and that has a side effect of hopefully making the decals appear to be much more part of the item. After those initial chips were done, I went inside some of them with a generic browny red rust colour, filling in the centre of some but not all of the chips. And then I added a second darker brown colour for the inside of a small number of the chips. To give the diorama a feeling of being lived in, even after the apocalypse, I used Photoshop to create a few wanted posters and a few newspapers. I printed those out in a variety of sizes. And I also printed a few generic posters as well, so a couple of posters for, say, music concerts, and a few pieces of general litter which I used later on as well. So for posters like this, which would be a music concert from before the apocalypse, I wanted those to be on the dumpster, but I wanted them to look like they were very, very old. So I took the poster, I soaked it in water for a very short amount of time, and that makes it soft enough that you can just pull it in half. And that half is what I stuck onto the dumpster. To fill the majority of the dumpster, which won't be seen, I took some tissue paper, soaked it in some cheap black acrylic paint and put it inside. And then I added a garbage bag and a cardboard box and a little glass bottle which I got from my Tamiya Churchill kit. Put the lid in place and chained it shut. And if you're wondering how I made that cardboard box, I will show you now. I took some card from some corrugated box that I had somewhere, made sure I chose the very thinnest parts of it, and then I roughly drew out a template for a box. I didn't bother to measure it, I didn't bother to use a ruler. I'm not quite sure how long a cardboard box would last outside anyway. And then I simply cut that in the right place, leaving a little bit extra for flaps to glue it together. Folded roughly along the lines. And glued it together with PVA glue before trimming off any excess. Could I have measured it? Yeah. Could I have used a ruler? Yeah. Would it have made much difference? Probably not. And for a closed box, I did the same thing, but of course I left an extra side on the template so it could be closed up. Some of these boxes would be destroyed or flattened by now, so I just made them and then crushed them in my hand. I wanted to build some wooden pallets to fill up the alleyway, so I made those from some styrene strips. To give the wood grain effect, I used some fairly coarse sandpaper. And then I put the strips together to form a simple wooden pallet. The colour was achieved by base painting in black, giving a light colour of buff over the top, and then a wash with various colours. This is Tamiya black panel liner, and I use the oil paints for the washes as well. I had a couple of pieces of stowage left over from a few military kits, so one of those I painted up and used a similar kind of wash technique. To make the garbage bags I could have used a variety of techniques. I decided to use the PVA glue technique which I used recently on my Tamiya quad for the tarp. So here I mixed some PVA glue with some black acrylic paint and a small amount of water, probably about 25% water. And when that is thoroughly mixed, you spread it out onto a flat surface. Here I'm using a piece of glass, and the liquid should self-level on that glass. Once that has dried overnight, you get something like this, which you can peel off the glass using a sharp knife at the edges. And that leaves you with something like this, which can be cut to shape. I used some scrunched up tissue paper to give the garbage bag some volume. Wrapped it around twisted the top closed, and I used some super glue to keep the top shut. At this stage I decided I wanted to have a shelter on the roof of the taller building, perhaps where our figure who's in the alleyway has been living. So I used a similar technique to make a green tarp which would form part of a tent. Now at this stage I realised that I didn't really like the road. It was missing something. It was a little bit too smooth. It didn't really look like an old road. And I wasn't sure what to do. I think the main problem was a lack of texture. Even after I'd weathered it using pigments, it didn't quite look right. So I decided I would use some thin corkboard, cut into shape, and hope that that corkboard would give a little bit more texture to the surface. Because of the various fittings on the buildings and the fence, I had to cut that into several sections. The advantage of corkboard is you can tear it quite easily and it looks like natural cracks in the road. For the straight edge crack I would deal with that as if it was a repair to the road. And I painted the cork using flat black, making sure to come at it from all angles to get into all the details. And I added a few lighter areas by adding some XF63 German grey into the black mixture. There were a couple of areas of small damage or chipping, and I covered those using some oil paint. And that brings the work for this step to a conclusion. As I say, this was going to be the final step, but I realised I still need to do lots of weathering on the road. I need to add some vegetation to make the area look like it's been reclaimed by nature, and of course I need to do the figures as well. So hopefully all of those things will be taken care of in the next video. So before we look at the progress so far, let me take a moment to thank my patrons who have supported the channel. Thank you very much guys, I really appreciate it. And also thank you to everyone who has donated through Ko-fi. There have been some really generous donations through that channel, and I'm greatly appreciative of your support. Thank you guys. Okay, here's our progress so far. And before we go, let's take a quick sneak preview of some upcoming videos. So guys, thank you again for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you next time.